Hello, everyone, and here we are back with Ways of the World, a brief global history with sources. As we continue our study of pastoral peoples on the global stage, here it is, guys. Breakout, the Mongol Empire. Okay, so let's start with from Temujin to Chinggis Khan, the rise of the Mongol Empire. All right, Temujin, he lived from 1162 to 1227, created the Mongol Empire. Mongols before Temujin were unstable, feuding clans and tribes, but his rise was all based off of his childhood. His father was a minor chieftain but was murdered before Temujin turned 10. And his mother held the family together by hunting and fishing after they were deserted by the clan. And when Temujin grew up, he drew together a small following of friends, allied with a more powerful tribal leader. And there's some shifting series of alliances, betrayals, and military victories, and eventually won a reputation as a great leader. And by 1206, the Mongol Tribal Assembly recognized Temujin as Chinggis Khan, or the quote-unquote universal ruler. And Chinggis Khan then began his expansion to hold his followers together. There's a major attack on China in 1209 that started a 50-year Mongol world war. Chinggis Khan, Urgadai, Mongke, and Kublai all created an empire that included China, Central Asia, Russia, much of the Islamic Middle East, and parts of Eastern Europe. And there are setbacks that marked the outer limits of the Mongol Empire. All right, here we are with the Mongol Empire in our map for 11-1. Encompassing much of Eurasia, the Mongol Empire was divided into 4 khanates after the death of Chinggis Khan. And we can see those 4 khanates here on this map. So which of the 4 included the traditional Mongol homeland? That's easy to see. The Great Khanate controlled the traditional Mongol homeland around present-day Mongolia. So what is a comparison of this map right here, 11-1, with the map of 7-1, the Silk Roads? When you compare those two, what does that suggest about the limits of Mongol expansion? And we'll go back to this one of the Mongol Empire, and again here of the Silk Roads. Again, what does that suggest about the limits of Mongol expansion? Well, a comparison between the two maps demonstrates that the Mongols' expansion outside of Russia was largely limited to the territory comprising the Silk Roads. All right, the Japanese samurai attacking a Mongol warship. So the Mongols are best known for the remarkable military victories that gave them one of the largest empires in history, but they experienced stunning defeats as well. None was more dramatic than the failed invasion of Japan in 1281. The armada assembled by the Mongols for this campaign was one of the largest in history, comprising thousands of ships and as many as 140,000 sailors and soldiers. With little experience in naval warfare, the Mongols built their armada by drawing on the resources of their vassal state Korea and their recently conquered subjects in China. But even with the aid of these seafaring peoples, this huge invasion fleet stretched the resources of the Mongols, who resorted to communicating the death sentences of criminals willing to serve in the fleet. Now, the invasion was the culmination of a deteriorating relationship between Japanese authorities and the Mongol ruler Kublai Khan, grandson of Chinggis Khan, and the founder of the Chinese Yuan dynasty. In the 1260s, Japan's government ignored the Khan's demands that it become a vassal state of the Mongol Empire. So in 1274, the Khan dispatched a raiding force against Japan that briefly landed on the main Japanese island of Kyushu. And this force both scouted a suitable invasion route and put pressure on the Japanese to accept Mongol demands. In the years that followed, the tensions increased, especially when the Japanese summarily beheaded Mongol envoys sent to demand their submission. Now, following the final conquest of China in 1279, the Khan shifted his attention to subjugating Japan. The massive invasion fleet sailed from ports in Korea and southern China with plans to combine off the shores of Japan. Now, the fleet from Korea arrived first and attacked the mainland without waiting for the Chinese fleet. The Mongols sought to establish a beachhead at the site where Mongol forces had briefly come to shore in 1274, but the heavily outnumbered Japanese forces were waiting for them behind recently constructed defensive walls, and unable to establish a beachhead, the Mongol fleet anchored in the harbor, where it was attacked by groups of Japanese warriors, the samurai, in these small open boats like the one depicted in the temporary scroll recounting the battle. On daring raids, often at night, the samurai boarded the much larger Mongol ships and engaged their crews in deadly close-quarters combat. And under pressure, the Korean fleet withdrew and made its rendezvous with the Chinese fleet, which had arrived in the waters off Japan. And the combined forces then moved against another Japanese island, where they engaged in a fierce all-night battle, a sea battle, that once again pitted the large sea-going ships of the Mongol armada against heavily outnumbered groups of samurai in these small raiding boats. And it was at this moment that a typhoon, named the kamikaze, or quote-unquote divine wind, by the Japanese defenders struck, destroying perhaps 30% of the Korean fleet and between 60 to 90% of the Japanese flotilla. And in the aftermath, the Mongol commanders abandoned the invasion, leaving behind thousands of shipwrecked soldiers and sailors on the beaches. Such was the role of the natural events in confounding human plans. And the defeat had little impact on Kublai Khan, whose empire recovered quickly from the setback, but the Khan never again turned his attentions to Japan, instead seeking to expand his empire elsewhere, including the islands of Southeast Asia, the target of another ambitious but unsuccessful naval expedition in the 1290s. And on Japan, the Mongol invasion had a much greater long-term impact. The destruction of the Mongol fleet through what was perceived as divine intervention strengthened the Japanese conceptions of their island nation as Shinkoku, or quote-unquote land of the gods. And memories of triumph over the Mongols continued to resonate into the 20th century. At the end of World War II, when Japan was again faced with foreign invasion, Japanese suicide pilots who sought to stop the Allied advance took the name kamikazes, evoking the memory of the typhoon that had turned back the Mongol invasion centuries earlier. All right, explaining the Mongol moment. So the Mongol Empire grew without any grand scheme, and by the time of his death, Genghis Khan saw conquest as a mission to unite the whole world. The Mongols were vastly outnumbered by their enemies, but they had good luck and good timing that played a role. China was divided at the time. The Abbasid Caliphate was in heavy decline. And the key to Mongol success was their well-led, organized, disciplined army. They had military units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors. The conquered tribes were broken up and scattered among these units. Tribalism was also weakened by the creation of an imperial guard and this highly organized unit. All members of a unit were killed if any deserted in battle. Leaders shared the hardships of their men. Elaborate tactics like encirclement, retreat, and deception were a big part. And the vast numbers of conquered peoples were incorporated into their armies. And it might sound barbaric or brutal that all members of a unit were killed if one deserted, but that also, in a sense, created unity. They didn't want to let their fellow countrymen down, and the idea was to promote fighting together. And the Mongol reputation for brutality and destructiveness was a major factor. Those who resisted were destroyed. However, the Mongols did keep those that they valued or felt could contribute to their empire. And they had a strong ability to mobilize their resources. Their elaborate census-taking and systematic taxation, a good system of relay stations for communication and trade, centralized bureaucracy began, and they encouraged commerce. The Silk Roads became safe again. They gave lower administrative posts to Chinese and Muslim officials, so they felt like they were contributing to the empire, and they practiced religious toleration. And this is a Mongol warrior. Obviously superb horseback riding skills, honed in herding animals that adapted to military purposes were central to Mongol conquest, as illustrated in this Ming Dynasty Chinese painting of a mounted Mongol warrior. So what does this image show about Mongol military techniques? Well, clearly the image demonstrates that the horse mobility, and the bow and arrow were vital components of the Mongol military. And it's important to know how empires used military forces to gain and maintain control. And that concludes our study of Breakout, the Mongol Empire. I will see you guys next time for Encountering the Mongols.